everyone, welcome back to my channel, Sharon Cullen Art. I had some response from people over on Instagram when I painted this barn recently in a night sky setting, and they were bummed that I did not have a video on it. So rather than repaint the same one, I'm just doing another barn, one that might even be a little bit simpler. That one was done in gouache, and the one that I'm doing today is done in gouache. This is the one that we'll be painting today. I hope you can see that. Yep, I think you can. And yeah, so this will all be done in gouache. I'm not using any specific, I was just using my good gouache. I like to paint with it because it's creamier. It has a little bit slower drying time. My G's Finest gouache is good that way as well. The gouaches, like this Himi style gouache, these aren't bad, but they're not quite as opaque. They're creamy, very creamy, easy to use. But I was looking at some of my old gouache, and years ago when I wanted to learn how to paint with gouache, there was nothing on YouTube about painting with gouache. So I went out and I bought myself some gouache, and it was like Reeves or something horrible like that. Sorry, Reeves Company, if you're listening, but the gouache is horrible. It would dry like that, and you couldn't move it around. So I went out and I got, I ended up buying another brand, off-brand, and it had the same issue. I gave up on gouache for like 2 years. Then I bought some Lucas gouache because, I don't know, maybe it was Lindsay, the Frugal Crafter. She was sponsored by Jerry's Artorama for a long time, and they sell a lot of Lucas stuff. Their gouache also dries too fast for me and is a little bit too chalky. Now, I love their water mixable oils. I love those. They're nice and creamy, but did not care for the gouache. I liked it at the time. I was able to paint with gouache, not real great, but I've got about 4 years under my belt now, but I still struggled a little bit with it, and I had recommended the gouache thinking it was good gouache. But then I went ahead and bought Winsor and Newton, Holbein, M. Graham, and fell in love. Those are my 3 favorite brands. G's Finest is a great way to get started. You can buy a set of 24 for $19, I think, on Amazon, at least here in the US. But they're an Australian company, but they sell on Amazon in the US. So if you're interested in getting into gouache, I recommend that to get started, just to see if you like it, because you're not going to invest a lot of money, yet you'll have a huge collection of colors. Not that you need those. Like today, I think I used black, burnt umber, might have used a little sepia, burnt sienna, yellow ochre. I used those colors. And then I used some green that was sitting in my palette. And then a little red, and that was it. Oh, of course, I used, to mix my snow, I used some blue and some pink. But really, all you need are your primary colors, and you can mix those earth tones. I just used them because I had them. So let's go ahead and get started painting this painting. I'm starting out by going in with the sky and using a little bit of indigo color, and I will also be using yellow ochre. Now that will turn a little bit green in the bottom portion, but I leave that underneath, and then I go over it after it's dry again with a little more yellow ochre, and that covers the green up. For the most part, it disappears. If you really look deeply, you could probably see it, but
to the naked eye, it doesn't look green. I did use a little bit of gray in there, but decided I was unhappy with it, so I go over it again with the darker blue. Remembering that darker colors in gouache will dry lighter, just like watercolor will dry lighter. This dries lighter, although it dries much lighter. The darker the color, the lighter it seems to dry, and then the light colors tend to dry much darker. So keeping that in mind, I will end up going over that again with some more indigo. I don't rinse my brush as often as you might think. In fact, when I go to grab that yellow ochre, all I did was wipe my brush off on a towel. But once I'm done with that area, then I'll rinse and I'll start mixing my reds for the barn. Oops, I lied, I forgot. I'm gonna go in and do the trees first. I'm using burnt umber, then I use a little, I believe, sepia and black for my trees. My black I put in last in order to add more darkness and depth to the area, like a night sky would do. The upper branches will end up staying lighter where the moon catches the light. Now here I'm starting in with burnt sienna, and I quickly realized that I don't like the way the color's looking, so I will be adding red to this in order to brighten it up. But I'm going to match the color throughout before I go ahead and change anything so that they're all the same color. Now I'm just going to add my red right over this burnt sienna to start and brighten it up. It's still not bright enough, so I'm going to brighten it even more. With my red, I did add just a little, barely a drop of black to my red paint in order to deepen the value. Now I'll begin to add color over that, putting in some grays to weather the barn siding. It's a little bit too wet when I first go in, so I dry my brush off on a towel, and now I'm just kind of throwing it on there. At first it looks a bit scary, but this is going to dry lighter and it'll start to blend in, and I'll be adding more shadowing, shading, more red over that until I get the blend just right. I go in lightly with my brush, very lightly, barely touching the surface, and my brush is very dry. There's hardly any paint on it, just enough to scrape across the surface and dry brush that on. And that's how I get the weathered look to the siding on the barn. This is where I spend most of my time in this painting, is working on that barn siding so that it looks like wood that's been weathered, and I'll go over it several times, layering but the rest of the painting took very little time at all. Now that that red is dry, I'm going to go back in with gray, but you see how I dabbed that gray off on my towel. And again, I'm barely touching the surface of the paper with my brush. Now I'm going in with yellow ochre on the brick area on the bottom, covering over the windows. I'm not concerned about that. I can go in later and drop those in very easily. And I had put some white in with that yellow ochre because yellow ochre dries very dark in gouache. But it was still drying too dark. As you can see, it's getting deeper and deeper. So I'm adding some white right on top of it so that I can lighten the value of that yellow ochre. And then later I'm going to go in and kind of dry brush and then drop some bricks in here and there with grays, different values of grays, and then white. I accidentally bumped my camera here, but I'm just going back over my sky now. I'm making the adjustments with the yellow ochre, then adding a little more indigo in to even everything out. Then I'll adjust my camera. With yellow ochre and then burnt sienna, I'm adding some grasses in front of the trees in the distance. And I'm just using a very small round brush to do that. I believe this is either a 0 or a triple aught. And I will begin putting in my pine tree here using a green that I just mixed up with some lighter green that was in my palette box, and then adding a little bit of blue to it, and a flat brush. I'm just going back and forth putting these branches in. The brush is kind of what do I want to say? It's kind of rough on the edges. I don't have it smoothed flat by running it across my palette, so it gives more of a branch effect to the branches. I'll come in close up so you can see that. I believe I've added a little ultramarine blue to my green here to make it darker so that I can get the undersides of the branches and the branches that would not be touched by the moonlight. Then I'm going to go back over the left-hand side where the moon is hitting it and the branches on the front side, adding yellow in order to brighten those branches up. You don't want to only hit the left-hand side because when you think of an actual tree being cylindrical, the tips of the branches on the back side would be hit as well as on the front side facing us, which is why I'm bringing that yellow around the front of the tree and even tapping a little bit further over to the right, just in some areas, and it gives it a more realistic look. Next, I'm going to just take an object to draw a circle for my moon. I'm using a glue stick, but over to the right, I do have a stencil. You can kind of see the green edge in the upper right-hand corner that I could have used, but this works just as good. I'm first going in with a relatively thin coat of white as I spray water into my palette there, and it will keep the background of the moon more of a lightish blue since I have that indigo underneath. Then I'll go over it again with thicker white and deepen the white in some areas of the moon. And when you're putting shadowing in on a window, it's really important to know where your light source is and where your perspective is. Standing on the ground in a distance, I am looking up at these windows, and the light is coming from the left upper corner. So I would put the shadow on the left side and on the upper portion where I can see, because the bottom windowsill area of the window would be, my vision would be blocked and I wouldn't see that area. So that's why I'm putting the shadows in on the left side and on the upper portion of the window pane. Now I'm going in with a little bit of gray and I'm dabbing straight down with my small flat brush. I'm not sure what size this is. I would say it was probably 1/4 inch, but that would be awfully wide for bricks. But I'm not putting a lot of pressure down, so I'm probably not getting the entire surface of the edge of that brush down on my wall. But even if I do, I'm overlapping these and it's just giving the illusion of brick. You're not really seeing the bricks, and we don't know what size they are. They could be very large.
I'm sorry, I'm a little bit off frame here. I'm just putting the shadowing in front of the buildings and the trees. These shadows at night are a little more dramatic too because it is dark outside, but the moon is lighting up the snow. The other shadows, though, would be in contrast pretty dark in comparison. You still do get some bounce back of light, which is why the building is brighter and that kind of thing, but I decided to keep the shadows darker. I am going to lighten the one that I'm doing right here in front of the building right now, though. I'll be taking some white paint, keeping my brush a little bit on the wetter side so that it mixes right in with the blue. Now I'm going ahead and I'm putting in some of the darker tree trunks for these trees, and then leaving some areas at the top lighter where the moon would be hitting or going through the forest between the trees a little bit. When putting the fence in, remember your distant fence posts will be less tall. They're going to look smaller, and then as you come forward, they'll become larger. So keep that in mind. Also, they will take on the slope, so you don't want to keep them all even, especially if they're coming down toward you. Like you see how I've brought them in on an angle that way. Also, the closer your fence posts come, the thicker they will become. Now, they look the same right now, but that's because I'm going to be putting shadowing on the other side, and I will be putting some highlight on them. The ones in the distance you'll hardly see, but then as I come closer, it'll become more apparent. Unfortunately, I'm off the edge of the page on my two closest posts, and I did put those in on an angle, like they were slightly falling over, rather than keeping them both absolutely perfect. All I'm doing right here is just adding grass shadows to the ground, and I'm sorry that I'm out of frame. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps me out a lot. And if you're not already, consider subscribing to my channel and hit that notification bell so that you will be notified of all my upcoming videos.
And remember, everyone, be courageous, paint with wild abandon, and most of all, be kind to each other. Take care. God bless you. See you next time.